Thank you so much again, and shout out to Smashing Magazine for inviting me to speak. So I'll start. Thanks for Vitaly for introducing me. Today I'll be talking about designing without bias. That can mean many things, but I'll go into that a little bit into detail. So a little bit about me. I know Vitaly dropped a lot of few companies I worked at, but I worked in Silicon Valley for around 8 years. I also taught at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. I was an adjunct professor, and I also taught in China for ACG, multiple universities and high schools as well. I'm a concept photographer on the side, and lately I've been actually been picking up shoemaking, which is probably something that came from COVID when I was locked down and just had nothing to do. Currently, like Vidley said, I am at Canva, but I had a very long journey internationally, coming from the West, and now I'm out here in Australia. So before I started, right, I went to Singapore from the States, and that's when I had a lot of questions in my mind before I started at this job, right? So for me, right, what comes to mind when you think about Southeast Asia? And I ask this from from the perspective of the biases that most people would have. So for me, the reason why I moved to Singapore, not just for the job, but as a Filipino American, I wanted to give back to Southeast Asia, but I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, as I obviously, had different thoughts about what entailed in Southeast Asia, right? So in general, right, most people would answer, well, when I think about Southeast Asia, I think about the beaches, the rice paddies, the temples, and probably the food. But there's actually a lot more going there than I expected in general. So what's actually happening in Southeast Asia right now? Well, the tech industry is growing although obviously COVID's slowing down a lot of the growth. A lot of companies are taking it seriously. And why is that? Why is Southeast Asia a region that people should probably start thinking about? There's 655 million people in the region. That's larger than the European Union, almost larger than North America. 90% of the internet users in the region are connecting primarily through their mobile phone, still using web, and obviously through mobile, right? So that's a lot of people coming online from a region as that many people. And around 2030, it's potentially going to be the fourth largest economy in the world. So it's a very fascinating region in that. And the company I went to was called Grab. So if you've ever been to Southeast Asia, you probably used Grab. Grab is very similar to Uber, where you can actually call a ride or a taxi. You can order food. You can also send deliveries as well. It's a super app. I was given an amazing opportunity to work on products from 0 to 1, and I was happy to help out on the consumer side as a lead, building the Grab food, which is very similar to Uber Eats or Deliveroo, wherever you are in the world, very similar to those food apps, from the ground up. But I had my own biases, right? So the biases that I talk about, right, designing with inclusivity, I had a lot of Western biases, right? And for someone that's obviously born and raised in America, it's very different when you have to work in a different culture and different mindsets. So before I start, I'm going to play this clip, and I'll talk more about it.
Yeah, please.
Before you go to pad thai, I have to taste it first. What do you want to know from me? Ask me.
Well, how is it?
Hmm?
Oh no! Look at that face.
This is not pad thai at all.
This is not pad thai. No.
Pad thai have to be sweet, sour, and salty.
I think that doesn't taste too bad. It's not perfect.
For you, but not for me.
So I love this clip. So this is Gordon Ramsay, and a lot of memes from Gordon Ramsay, right? He's usually throwing f-bombs, cursing at people on Hell's Kitchen, but you can see he's in a different environment. He's in Thailand in this clip, and he's in the Thai chef's kitchen, right? Gordon Ramsay has just made pad Thai, and obviously the Thai chef is not impressed. And if you actually listen to the chef's words, right, maybe it's good for you, but not for me, right? And so these are things that I encourage you all to have like a more discerning eye when you're designing, right? Not making sure that the designs aren't just good for you. It's for the people, the users that are utilizing, whether it's web, mobile, whatever it is, right? And so what do I mean by that when you have to discern? Do you know the age you're designing for, the gender, nationality, education, zip code, language? These things do matter. I think for someone that has primarily in my beginning of the career designed products in the West, primarily in English, having that culture shock of designing for multiple languages in Southeast Asia is pretty difficult. And I'll get into that more detail later, but you have to be a little bit aware of potentially how that could impact your designs, but also how your design scales, right? Not just on an app, but how it potentially scales to the web. So identify like how unconscious and potentially systematic biases show up every day, and you need to just build empathy and understand. This isn't a non-exhaustive list, but in general, just understand who you're designing for. And I apologize for this, obviously loud screen, but the book Radical Candor. One thing that a lot of designers tend not to talk about is also working with potential stakeholders, right? So for me, coming from the West, there's a focus on being the loudest voice in the room, potentially, and especially in New York and in California, also debating a lot. But working in Asia, you had to align, you had to come together, and that seems like it's common sense, but it's more of a collective nature. Not everyone is so aggressive or loud in the room. So for me, I had to learn how to really change my language, change how I worked, and how I actually told the story of how design impacts uh, the user, and obviously impacts the usability, and obviously how it impacts the business as well. So some things for me that I had to adjust, right? That was a culture shock for sure when I worked internationally. Another thing, right? In real life situations on the ground, I think we tend to forget that not a lot of people have access to technology, right? So there are going to be restaurants sometimes in Southeast Asia, India, or even Africa that may, actually have the money to afford a Revolut or Square set up in their restaurant, right? And that's very digital. But then, of course, we have these folks that work food carts that still have access to older Android devices and still take cash, right? So you have to think holistically of how your design scales. I've been in many meetings where we tested these applications or even mobile web designs, and they look very poor on older Android devices, right? They break, whether it's just how slow they are or potentially how bad the Wi-Fi is in the area. So these things you do have to think about potentially micro interactions, how offline mode may work on some of these mobile web designs or apps, right? So I think you have to be aware of potentially how your design may impact people in general. And it's fascinating, right? And when I was living in China for a little bit, there is a food service called Elema, and in China they've done an amazing job of actually servicing their users. Now they actually offer their drivers, and it's a group of drivers, right, a square radius around the city, and in that square radius, the drivers actually go to the same restaurant, they go to the same people, pretty much every day. And for some people that may be uncomfortable, but on another level, if you think about it on a service design level, right? These drivers are actually creating relationships with the restaurants. They're actually creating relationships with the people that they deliver to. You have this sense of familiarity with this driver. And the driver also obviously knows how to get through the city faster in these square radiuses around the city. So, think about how your designs actually not just impact the user, but also potentially the drivers involved as well, like other third parties, I guess, is what I'm trying to, tell you. Just be inclusive and not just focusing on one stream, but also thinking about other streams that may impact your design flows, right? And obviously, I'm not a diehard Apple fanboy, but now I know a lot of designers are. iPhone and Android, this has always been a competition in general, but when you look at the market share around the world, Android is pretty heavy, especially in the use. So it's around 71% that are pretty much Android, right? And everyone else around 27% iOS, iPhone, right? But in Asia, Android's around 80%, which is crazy if you think about it, right? So how do your designs, impact that? Especially if a lot of folks still have older Android devices. I keep saying that, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I tell people, right, no dynamic island that we're so stoked about is coming to potentially Asia or India very quickly, right? Android's still king. And maybe for some folks that's bad news, but I think this is some things that you do have to think about. And it's funny because obviously we have biases for larger companies, right? But when we look at Amazon, who struggled to keep up with the market, especially servicing e-commerce, whether it's in Asia, India, and some other parts of the world, right? They've struggled. And you have local competitors like here, Shopee, that have actually taken advantage of that. And whether it's because they are working with regulators more, whether they actually understand the market and they localize and contextualize for those users, that's something that is shown, and it's shown actually in the success of Shopee overthrowing Amazon in Asia, which is fascinating. And it's funny to me because you see all these articles saying AR, VR, on the Amazon side, people will start adopting e-commerce, but that's not necessarily true. Again, when you look at people's pretty much socioeconomic status, not a lot of people can still afford AR, VR devices, especially in Asia. And when you think about folks that could potentially afford it, it's probably China, Japan, Korea, but the rest of Southeast Asia probably not, right? So you have to think about that in general, right? So another case, right, when you look at like web design, I think a lot of us may be overwhelmed by how Shopee looks and has all these items here, right, with a lot of detail, with a lot of stuff going on the page, versus Amazon where it's a little bit cleaner and nicer. And maybe we're used to that, but we have to realize that there's actually a lot of different use cases out there, especially users, and their wants and needs are very different in different parts of the world. I'll get into more detail again later on and talk more about this because I think a lot of us, especially designers, we are so attached to this modern clean aesthetic, which is fine, but there's a different aesthetic out there that obviously serves the business needs and also serves the users in different parts of the world. So a tip: don't let new technology or ideals or even big brands dictate your actual needs and wants, or even cloud your judgment, right? Localize your designs and contextualize for your users. Understand the users in their real world situations or scenarios. So how can you analyze, right? So a lot of us, we have a lot of assumptions in regard to these traits of whether they speak English, whether it's male dominated in some cultures, the age. How do these assumptions pretty much affect your design, your usage, your decision making, right? Who are your users? These folks may not be Westerners, they may not be high class. Think about their socioeconomic situations, right? In the features that you design or potentially put together, who are you excluding from this experience? How might this feature actually support or create a bias system? And what metrics of success are being used to define how successful this product is? So think about that in a way. I think a good example of this is a lot of us, we're so used to potentially going to the bank or going online and signing up for potentially a bank account. Here, like a Chase, they have a fancy setup. Sometimes they have folks to, sit there and talk to us and walk us through signing up for a bank account, but which is very different when you go to Asia. I know this is also something that you see in India and Africa. I'm going to specifically talk about Indonesia, but there's some parallels, right? So in Indonesia, there's more than 6 in 10 people that are unbanked. Only 17% of the transactions are cashless, and there's a massive opportunity, right? And there's an issue here, right? And the issue is historic. A lot of folks in Indonesia don't trust the government. They actually have to drive 2-3 hours just to get to a bank. Even in Jakarta, the traffic is really bad, which is their mega city, and takes maybe 3 hours just to get to a bank because the traffic's so bad. So a lot of people refuse to drive to the bank. They refuse to even fill out paperwork. Some of them actually struggle to read as well. And like I said, they don't trust the government as well and these financial institutions. But who do they trust? Well, they trust the local shopkeeper down the street, the local shoe keeper potentially, or the guy that runs the bodega or deli, right? These folks are trustworthy because they're pretty much trusted through family, hearsay, through the community, through the neighborhood, right? The store owner could pretty much, you could deposit money with the store owner. They could give you back money if you wanted to withdraw. It's fascinating. And, for a Westerner like me or anyone else, we'd be shocked. And we probably wouldn't trust this guy with our money because we're so used to the financial institutions or potentially the experiences that we grew up with. But these folks, right, especially in India and Indonesia or Africa, this is very common. So something to think about in terms of what opportunities lie in your experience that you could potentially take advantage of, and not just in the Western mindset, but potentially internationally as well. And it's fascinating because I think a lot of us as designers, we sit with our users in labs. But for me, I got the blessing, and it felt very Anthony Bourdainish to actually sit down, break bread with some users. We did 8 to 9 interviews, not just at restaurants, as you can see here, but we also came to people's houses. We ordered food, and I actually had just a chat with folks about their usage of how they ordered food in general. So for this clip, or not clip, sorry, this photo, these folks actually hated ordering online. They would rather go to the restaurant. They would rather, feel that ambiance with the movement, with the food, the smells, talking to the waiter. But if you think about it, the questions that we asked them, right, how they order food, how they interacted, and how what we perceived was fascinating. So the little tidbits and nuggets of potential solutions came up through conversation. So when they talked to the waiter, they were like, "Oh, what's the chef's recommendations for day? What promotion deals do you have? What's like the meal that most people would get?" So for that, turning it around and actually potentially using it as carousels in potentially a web design or even an app, especially on an e-commerce site, and labeling it a section, calling it chef's recommendations for this restaurant, or potentially also labeling it as promotions and discounts. Those nuggets, right? That helped a lot in terms of figuring out what people would want and when they're ordering. So it's fascinating that I think learning from those physical interactions and not just talking to people in labs is a big difference maker for sure. And it's fascinating. So when I usually tell people this, people are usually shocked. So Uber does not exist in Southeast Asia anymore. They actually failed in 2019. And Uber spent 200 million annually just to take on Grab, which is the company I was working at, just to invest in Southeast Asia, and they failed. That's not to say that they tried, but I think there's a lot of reasons that actually comes back down to pretty much being inclusive in their designs, right? They weren't aware that people still used cash. They didn't have that payment method in their experience, which was a big killer as well. They didn't really localize their content, and that was something that we had a large content team in different languages, from Thai to Indonesian Bahasa to Vietnamese, and they localized, and we localized and contextualized, and Uber really failed their users in that regard. So just make sure that you're actually, again, localizing and actually contextualizing who you're designing for. And it is odd seeing Uber not existing in Southeast Asia, but yes, it does not exist anymore. So if you ever go in Southeast Asia, don't expect an Uber to pick you up. So, like I was saying before, when we looked at Amazon's website versus Shopee, there are different jobs to be done. So I'm going to flip it and look at how people pretty much order, especially on e-commerce. And I'm just going to use an app as an example. So this is Instacart, and people in the States are probably familiar with this. It's pretty clean, right? It's easy to add items with a large plus button, and you can notice that there's a very clean save $1 to show that the user can save on this item. But when you look at jobs to be done in Southeast Asia, for a lot of us, like I said, we could be overwhelmed. But for users and the needs and wants that they want, right? They actually want to understand how their membership to potentially Tiki, just for example here, is actually impacting their items that they're ordering. So they actually want to see surface the discounts, potentially free shipping, obviously, and all this stuff thrown at them. And it's funny because if I go back here, we actually designed a very similar screen to this on Grab Food, and people were saying, and in Vietnam, they were saying that this screen was too rich for them, which is very interesting, right? They thought it was too wealthy for them, and they would rather have something like this. So again, our biases got the best of us. It's just assuming that this modern clean design, prior was probably we thought was the best one, but turns out our user needs and jobs to be done are completely different in Southeast Asia. So great designs create valuable businesses, right? But great designs doesn't have to be clean and modern. And I know that's a hot take, but for me, that has now worked internationally. I can tell you that Some people just want things very simple, and it may be loud, but it's actually creating those designs are creating valuable businesses for the business that obviously you work for or I work for in general. So ideation. So how do you ideate to make sure that you're not creating these biases? So a lot of people will assume that double diamond is potentially a silver bullet. Maybe it's OOUX. So shout out to Sophia Prater, who's also come out with this. Um, they're great as frameworks, and I encourage everyone to look at them as frameworks, but they're not really silver bullets when you have to design internationally or even taking into account your biases, right? So what's a more human way that I usually tell people, and it may be very hippie-ish, but what I tell people is treat every user as if they're your grandmother. And why do I say that, right? So let's say you just dropped your grandmother off at home and she needs to get from the car to her bedroom. So you want that journey from point A to point B to be very safe, right? You want to see how she, puts her hand on potentially on the railing and you want to make sure that she can see where she puts her foot to go into the house. You want to make sure that she can see where she can flip the switch to turn on the lights, and obviously, making sure that the lighting and everything is safe for her to get to her final destination. So obviously, right, it is very human, but I think it's a very tangible thing that to think about treating your users and making sure that they have a safe journey from beginning to end. And I usually ask a lot of designers like, who are you ideating with? Because I do see a lot of designers like, oh, I don't want to talk to product people. They're messing up the designs, or they're just too opinionated. But I think we also get in silos as designers when if we design, we just design, right? We need to make sure that we have a diverse, different mindsets. And I know that's hard for a lot of designers, especially when they have to debate, and it's not very sometimes it's not productive, right? And I think we go through these issues with different people, but having those different perspectives, having those different potentially metrics that are set, having those potentially different visions out there and putting it together, I think that creates more valuable design, to be honest. And you can see that with these folks that I'm about to show, right? So for Facebook, they ideated around actually localizing. So they did a great job at actually taking into account poor Wi-Fi in different areas of the world. So this 2G or Facebook Lite, it was designed for 2G for Indonesia, but also in India as well. And obviously the core functionality is completely different, right? So there's no high-res images here. There's no autoplay in videos. It's actually pretty respectful to the Wi-Fi and how people potentially use the web in general. Obviously, the new Facebook interface has autoplay, high-res buttons, and there's smaller buttons as well, which is fascinating, right? And so these are things you have to take into account and in ideating, right? Ideating and making sure that you're serving these different cases. And this is actually a great case of how Facebook's trying to localize in general. Netflix also does that in making sure that it scales. Their design scales for different parts of the world, right? So maybe in Southeast Asia, this is specifically in Singapore, right? Potentially they have movies that are more focused on Singaporean culture. And obviously, if you're in America, your designs and everything else will scale for anything that's maybe retro Americana in terms of entertainment, which is wonderful. What's not great, though, is if for someone that has potentially accents or hyphens in their name, sometimes it's really a pain in the butt to do taxes internationally. I can't tell you how many of my friends have complained about this. It's really, really sad because a lot of people are excluded and they're super frustrated and they have to pay X amount more just to, get their names, rightly so, filled in and correctly filled in these forms potentially for tax, right? And yes, there are companies out there that can help you out and potentially, course correct that, right, on the web. But this is pretty unfortunate that we haven't thought about this. And for me, I've actually struggled with this even with payments as someone that sometimes pays via credit card or from my card internationally for potentially American goods. I get rejected a lot because I don't use my American card for a lot of things. So it's frustrating, but it's maybe a minor detail, but for maybe someone that doesn't have the privilege that I have to have American card, it's sort of a bummer, right? So some things to think about of who you're excluding in your experience. Um, So how do you be objective? How do you make sure that there's pretty much no bias? That's pretty difficult, as I mentioned earlier, right? So I love showing this illustration. There's always going to be one person that's, confident enough to go across the tightrope of the experience, but everyone else is pretty much not wanting to cross that bridge, which is no pun intended, right? But if you make that experience more, I guess, inclusive and more safe, like as I mentioned before, guiding these folks from point A to B safely, these people will feel more comfortable within that experience. So here are some bad objective designs that are out there that have been known about in general. And I'm talking more from ad design perspective. So in Japan, this is also true in the 70s and 80s. They would just use Caucasian people to showcase that this is a premium product, whether it's for photography, booths, or potentially ads. It's unfortunate, but that's something that tends to happen out in the world, especially in Asia. And I love that this old article from the Shopify designer where she talks about that drawing purple people isn't really inclusive, right? This just excludes more people. You're just coloring them purple instead of showing, the diversity of real people. So making sure that this should be more diverse. This is a bad example of inclusion. Another thing that I struggled with as a real story was actually designing an icon for the Grab Food product that I worked on. So the assumption for most people is like, oh, chopsticks. Everyone in Asia uses chopsticks. That's not necessarily true, especially in Southeast Asia, where people still may use hands, spoons, and whatnot. So for me, I had to illustrate a famous dish in Southeast Asia instead of just using chopsticks. So again, very biased, right? So making sure that the dish represented all of Southeast Asia, which was tricky, but we figured it out over the course of time. So again, check your biases, right? So what are good examples of not having biases in design? So Lemonade does a great job of potentially showing if you're single, you have a partner and kids, or you're if you have kids or just my kids, right, or other. And there's no biases here. It's just using toothbrushes, which is wonderful. It's very smart. Another good example is actually making sure that your design system is actually inclusive, right? Making sure that it actually entails different languages, different currencies, how your designs, either scale up in terms of height or width. These are things that we tend to forget about. And like I said earlier, like I was so used to designing for English, I totally forgot there are other languages. And that was like maybe eons ago, but now I always think about how my design system scales for different languages all the time. So when I usually do this presentation, most people ask the impact of inclusion. So the impact of inclusion, well, let's talk about that. And let me play this clip really quickly. So I feel like this happens to a lot of designers, right? We are fully confident about the designs, the experience, and obviously amazing drop shadows or gradients or whatever. But then when we get into a stakeholder meeting, we are punched and dropped down, just like Kevin here. So I think one thing you have to remember, especially when you're trying to be inclusive, right, is design influence is with our stakeholders. It doesn't start with our design tool. So a lot of us, right, we think that our influence comes from our designs, which is partly true, but it's also influencing our stakeholders. And I get it. A lot of us, especially designers that I know, are introverts. Some of us just hate the back-to-back meetings. It's a very human aspect that we need to take into account, especially as designers as we grow, right? And I'll get to that in a second. And at so many companies, startups, or even agencies, right, the leading problem aren't technical problems; they're human problems, right? right? Which is very, very hard to fix. So what do we do in these cases, right? And how do you be inclusive? So instead of having empathy map for your users, why don't you flip it? And again, I'm not asking you to do a workshop with your team, but maybe do your own homework and take notes of who you're emphasizing with, right? With your stakeholders, especially of what they do, what they need to see, what they say, what they hear, what do they think, and what do they feel, right? And why do I say this? This is very important, especially as you scale up as a designer and grow in your career, right? So Mia Bloom, she is an amazing design leader. She actually put together this management gradient in general, but you can see here from an IC to manager to executive, right? Your design influence isn't just through your designs. It's not through the tools. It's actually talking and working with other people. It's all about the relationships, right? And at the end of the day. So to be frank, design inclusion isn't just about your users. It's about being inclusive to your stakeholders and bringing value as a partner. So I ask you, like most of the designers here, right? What story are you telling to your stakeholders? And what do I mean by that? So I've interviewed a lot of designers. I've seen many portfolios, and usually the story goes like this: the designer has designed an amazing checkout system here, based on user research. Right, it's easy for the user to add items. Users want to double check their personal details, and it was pretty clear for the user to check out. And I made this neat animation at the end to make sure that the user is verified to paid. But when you present this in front of different stakeholders, this is not inclusive. This may be inclusive for potentially designers, and maybe users understand it, but you're presenting in front of your other stakeholders, right? You're trying to get buy-in. You're trying to show how the value of design, right? So what potentially your partners want to hear, right? And I'll go through this pretty quickly. I don't want to read everything, but obviously if you're going to present it, you probably want to use words like retention rate, obviously increasing the GMV. Users were able to check out 7 times faster in this design. It increases customer satisfaction. So you can see the change of words. It changes obviously the story that you're telling. But again, what language do your stakeholders speak, right? It's not just about your users, but it's also how you portray your designs in different settings, right? And there are real world cases of this, right? So let's look at Airbnb's redesign that happened maybe a few years ago, right? And I guarantee, I don't want to guarantee because I don't want to assume that Airbnb went through this, but there is a site that actually tracks all the changes that Airbnb does, which is fascinating, right? So you're not just designing for users, you're designing to get buy-in from your stakeholders as well. So how the presentation probably went is like, hey, we're trying to increase engagement by 10% and make it easy for people to book, especially when, through listings, a lot of people probably get a lot of details, especially for the photo, right? So to pretty much experiment and look at different phases of listings, and also being aware that there's a lot of PR backlash for our host. Our mission for Airbnb is belong anywhere. So we took out the photo of the host and just made it all about the listing, right? And the vision is to create an experience where users want to book a listing based on location, and our hosts are judged by their listing and not their background or photo, right? So it's a wonderful design strategy that Airbnb came up with. And obviously they thought about it holistically and impacted the web, impacted their mobile app as well. But there are a few things that you can take away as a designer from this, right? With their design strategy. Impact on long tail revenue, obviously bringing people to smaller cities, communities. And why is that? Why did people want to go to these smaller cities or communities in general? Well, it put pressure on hosts to up their game, right? To have better photos in general, but also have better bios on the Airbnb, better details, right? And if you're scouring for Airbnbs, you're probably going to get drawn potentially to also awesome categories that they potentially have as well, right? And these long-term changes in travel actually impacted a lot of the travel industry, right? So the lesson is how small the design changes can potentially impact people behave. And Airbnb obviously did a great job with the redesign, and it's obviously changed how people are designing or how traveling, sorry. I was also privileged to work on a feature called Audio Protect. It's very similar to Uber, where you can actually record your ride as a passenger or even driver. And for a lot of us on the West, we are freaked out by our rides potentially being monitored. But in Southeast Asia, a lot of women, especially, are either kidnapped, murdered, raped, or even worse, right? So I got the privilege to work on Audio Protect but there was a lot of people that were scared of launching this product actually to the region, because a lot of people were actually, obviously wary of the data and what companies do with it. So the marketing team came up with this amazing video where they actually had women fall asleep in a car, and she safely got to her destination. It was fascinating, because on top of that, we launched this video on International Women's Day, and people emphasized, and they emphasized with, obviously the drama, the cases that were happening in Southeast Asia with all these potentially murders and or kidnappings or whatever, right? So I think people emphasized with the story that we were telling, right? And that brought value to the feature and the design and the experience. So something to think about, right? Not just selling it to your stakeholders, but also how you market it to your real users. So how do you want to be valued as a designer? So as I wrap up, a lot of us, right, we're going through a lot. I think the design industry, especially designers, are struggling right now, right? So there are a lot of layoffs that are happening currently, and I'm not going to say that it won't be the end of it, because we're in a transition stage right now. But I feel like layoffs are less of a wave, and it's more of a ripple in general, right? I don't think it's an apocalypse. There's this great article by Jacob Nielsen, you should look it up, that came out last year. It talks about the angst, right? The job openings that dropped, but also talks about how a lot of companies, they overhired during COVID as well. So I think we're just going through a downturn. But on top of that, right, we're also scared. I think a lot of us, generally, we're scared of AI potentially taking our jobs, which is pretty scary, right, when you think about it. We're in a renaissance of AI. A lot of people are creating AI startups to do designs, do photos, do experiences, right? And we are freaked out by that, which is understandable. And there are influencers out for us, which is really frustrating when you obviously go on social media and you read about this. It's really annoying. But let's take a step back. In 2017, Airbnb came out with this technology where you can actually draw a sketch, and actually a program would actually create the sketches for you and put it together, which is fascinating. And this is back in 2017. Now, I'm not saying that you should be freaked out or you should calm down. I think that would be very mean or sort of apathetic of me, right? But when you look at these designs, right, and when you look at how they're generated, there isn't any value behind these designs when you think about it, right? There's no user feedback, there's no business strategy, there's no getting folks aligned on the idea. It's not actually going to the market, right? We were freaked out about web design ending print, but it didn't really happen, did it? So I think we need to figure out, as a design community, to bring better stories and tell the impact of value and bring value to design through, obviously our work, but also with our stakeholders and our teams in general. It's not just about having beautiful designs on Dribble all the time, even though I know that's a hot take. So I encourage you to build an inclusive mindset. So usually when I do this talk, I ask people to put up their phones. And maybe if you have a friend or your mom or dad near you, right, I encourage you probably to take their phone, right, and put it in your pocket. Now, that's a little bit weird. Yeah, taking your friend or mom's phone, just putting it in your pocket, that's really awkward, right? But in reality, right, that device is actually pretty inclusive if you think about it, right? But it's after you put photos, passwords, an identity to that item that it's really awkward with that person's potentially life in your phone, in your pocket, right, as a phone. But in reality, that's actually inclusion in terms of sitting with that uncomfortableness of another person's identity in your pocket. Now, I'm not telling you to go steal and feel uncomfortable like that, but I'm just telling you to be more aware and sit with those uncomfortable feelings when you have to design or potentially work with different stakeholders in the industry, right? I encourage you, right, not just to look for voices or books in the West and minimal or modern design, right? Look for voices around South America, Central Asia, or even in Asia, right? There are some amazing things happening, not just in Japan, but I guarantee there are probably amazing things happening also in Singapore, India, or even Africa, right? So there's 3 things to take away from today. Be aware of your privilege, design beyond the screens, and be ultra inclusive. As someone that has taught around the world and also, been a role model, especially in Asia. I think it's great for the next generation to see that, and representation does matter. So I encourage you to get out of your ivory tower. And I'm not telling you to move out of the States, but I'm telling you just to be more aware. And so I challenge you, like when John Maeda challenged me back in 2015, he challenged me, like I do for today, to design inclusively and think outside of the box and what may be cool, but to design for what is right, and not just for the community, but for everyone around the world. Thanks, folks. Thank you for having me. Let's connect.
Fantastic, Jay. Well, that was impressive. I mean, well, I took so many notes in here, and also so many things resonated. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the talk, and everyone who is was watching or listening to us now. Could you please give a round of applause to Jay for it? There are a couple of questions, Jay. And I actually want to, I mean, I probably have like, I think 9 at this point that I want to bring up. And I think one issue that I struggle every now and again is this notion of making a strong case. So I feel like I've got a little bit better over time, but almost every other time I feel like I'm sitting in the room and I'm trying desperately to explain what inclusive design means and what accessibility means. And still, it's very often the case, and please, dear friends who are kind of watching us now as well, please let me know if this is the case for you or not. I feel like sometimes it's loud, and sometimes it's like sitting between the lines that, you know, it's an edge case. We don't want to spend time and waste time on edge cases. We don't have budget for it. We don't have time for it. We can do it later. Why should we? I mean, we have a core audience. We need to focus on the core audience.
Yeah.
Let's keep the focus. This is what I hear. I can't stand it anymore. Let's keep the focus of where we are and what our audience is, and design for them and with them in mind. Let's not do the 20 things and then do them all wrong. Let's do one thing and do it right. How would you say, or what would you say is the most effective way to advocate for inclusion in this sort of environments? Like sometimes they can be very corporate. Sometimes they can be just very much, you know, we have a main case. Let's not look at edge cases for now. And this for now, you know, remains always.
Well, there's 2 ways you can go about it. And there's the interpersonal way where you actually create relationships with other folks that may be passionate about it, right? In the higher ups, that actually understand like what you're coming from, and showing those solutions to them. And for some folks that may feel political, but for all honesty, I think you need those allies to actually help push designs forward in general, right? And like I said, a lot of designers, they don't like mixing the whole, you know, debates and creating these relationships, but they do matter, especially in large companies, or even if you're like a freelancer going into potentially a new type of corporate world, and you're just there being a contractor. So you have to find these relationships and create those relationships with people that you can trust and know that are going to be like an ally on your side, right? And then there's the other case where I think about is just designing a vision and not just showing them, showing them what they want, which is like, hey, this is like phase 1, but phase 2, we have a dream of doing X, Y, and Z. So starting off with potentially what they want, but also taking it a little bit further. I found that's actually been helpful for me. For some people, it works. For some people, it still doesn't work, because obviously some people, I think it's subjective for, you know, obviously, especially large corporations, as you're saying, Vitaly. So it's not an easy answer I'm giving. I know that's the hardest part about it.
No,
because I don't think
it's an honest answer. So that's
yeah, I don't think there is a wrong or right way, but for me, it has, what I found is creating relationships with the right people, but also having a nice vision, and that comes into what they want, but also pushing it further.
Do you think, Jay, in general, that if you, let's say, are designing, let's say, an application that's supposed to go to all the different markets, that's supposed to go to Southeast Asia, that's supposed to go to India and so on. Now, as somebody who is maybe used to, you know, designing in the Western world, let's say, has been designing for a while, applications, the websites, the landing pages, the e-commerce websites and everything. Do you think it's even possible to design something that is heavily optimized for, let's say, a Southeast Asian market? It feels like to me, just maybe let me roll back for a moment. It feels like if I ask somebody today to design a website as if it was, I don't know, like a grungy 90s,
Yeah.
late 90s sort of website, I think that today, first of all, it would be very difficult for me, like, remember rainbow gifts and stuff like that. I probably would fail. And I feel like maybe in many ways, if you actually have a very different approach to design, both in terms of like what should be where and the white space and the colors and everything, then it might be remarkably challenging, maybe even impossible to
Yeah.
actually be good at it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's some challenges regardless wherever you're coming from, especially if we're going to design for a new region. That's not to say though, I know there are a lot of people from South America that when I talk about this, they're like, oh wow, South America is very similar to how users react shopping on e-commerce, right? So there is a segment of users that are very similar out there. So it's just a matter of finding that target audience that will potentially what's the word, that will come and actually enjoy that experience that you've designed, right? So it's just a matter, I mean, it's very similar to like running a startup. You're going to have to find the right target audience and scale up. And I think that's the hardest part, especially if you're joining a startup in Southeast Asia. They just focus on Southeast Asia. They're not trying to go into the States. They're going to focus on what they're good on. So it's just a matter of making sure that you're designing for something that the company is focused on, but also you know your target user in general.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Claire asked also, it's a bit more technical at this point. Do you have any recommendations or resources for testing on older devices or in low bandwidth regions or scenarios? Is there sort of an extension that supports the type of testing? Unfortunately, I don't have access to user testing, so looking for other options. I designed for rural users in the Southwest USA and Navajo Nation, where internet service is very limited.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I mean, you can get cheap phones, like older phones, older devices actually on eBay if you wanted. I know that's very possible. So for like $20, $30 from what I've seen. So maybe start there. Look for those cheap devices where you can potentially look at, because those older devices are pretty damn slow. And I obviously had the privilege to have those devices of where I work, but you can pretty much get those devices for cheap. I'm pretty sure eBay or Facebook Market in general. So start there. Start with those older devices, and if you have access to older laptops, even better, right? Because then you can actually sense check how your designs actually are impacting or scaling on different devices. So that would be my recommendation.
And there's maybe one more note I wanted to add, just because it's really resonated with me so well. Because when you mentioned the notion of contextualizing, right? I think in many ways, when we think about anything, like any user flow, any customer journey or anything, it is actually quite common for us to see it as a sort of a linear path. So you start here, then you have another touch point, and then off you go, and then basically you bought something or you completed the task or whatever. This is kind of what happens. But I think in many ways, it's just really not representing reality most of the time. Because if I think about the customer journey, very often people jump between different things. There might be one customer journey for one persona, if you like, and there's another customer journey for another persona. And then very often people just change their thoughts, change opinions, they work on hunches and stuff like that. And very often also, when you look at what is happening, very often the experience starts before the first official touch point, being the website or landing page. It can be happening on a QR code. It could be happening on, I don't know, in SMS, WhatsApp, and whatnot, and doesn't necessarily end where it ends. So I'm just thinking, what would you say is the best way to capture maybe actual user experience? Or I know it's probably quite a difficult question at this point, but I couldn't find, I didn't find it yet. So I think in my way, I'm still operating with customer journey maps and jobs to be done and all the things. But when you're working on anything really, like what is, maybe, I know we don't have that much time. Could you maybe describe what are some of the things that help you to reduce that bias, or maybe tools or frameworks or templates or
Yeah.
toolkits?
I think one thing that we used to do, and I know we still do, at my current company is actually like real life scenarios. So I'll just use my past company as an example where, let's say we reenacted like a scenario if someone was a driver and we just role played, right, in potential cases of like real situations that would actually happen. So we would role play, whether it's in a car or even a room. It's just very simple, but it was just fascinating, like the little things that you could actually take away from reenacting scenarios because you wouldn't think about it at that point in time, right? So, and a real thing that I did test is we were testing something that had to deal with voice activation on an older device, and that was very tricky. But we tested it in Thailand, and we had to convert obviously the voice assistant to Thai. That was very difficult, but actually testing it and how drivers reacted to it in their car is like a totally different experience because then you start figuring out like, oh, how do people communicate with their phones? How do they look at the phone? Where do they usually place their phone? How do bikers now like communicate with their phone? So there's like all these little things that you don't think about. So usually I tell people just recreate the situation, or find a situation or find people that are willing to like try it with you. Obviously, if it's like NDA, I don't encourage you
Yeah,
to
sure.
like do something like that. But those cases helped a lot, especially when you have to think holistically, right? So
Oh, that's fascinating. I never thought about this way. If anything, I would be maybe thinking about storyboarding, but this is great. This is fantastic. Well, I think we'd speak for hours, and maybe we should. That's a separate story. But thank you
next
so
time.
much, Jay, for your wonderful insights. And dear friends, I hope I didn't miss any questions that came up in here so far. So please give a wonderful round of we already had dragon fruit, apple emojis. Are you okay with apples, Jay?
Apples are great.
Okay, excellent. So here we go. So, dear friends, please not throw. Mm, no, we don't want to throw apples at you. Maybe add politely and kindly a few apples, red or green. We accept any color really in the chat as a kind thank you to Jay for the wonderful presentation and sharing the experience and insights with us. Thank you so much, Jay.